So, may I introduce the first speaker tonight, Sigrun. She is an associate professor in cultural and community psychology at the University of Oslo. She has a bachelor's degree in social psychology from the University of Oslo and a master's degree in social, cultural, and community psychology and a PhD in political psychology from NTNU in Trondheim. Her work focuses on mainly on social identities and conflict. During her fieldwork in Rwanda, Zanzibar, and Sudan, she focused on how leadership attempts to use feelings of social identities in the population to build more unity or to fragment the population. Today, she's going to tell us about researching the non-existent, identity research in contexts where identity is not a word. In many spheres of psychological research, one often relies on translators. Therefore, in her talk, she wants to share with us some of the challenges that can occur in translated contexts, where it turns out that something one assumes works as a word in another's language does in fact not exist. She hopes her talk will give us all food for thought when working in translated contexts. So please welcome Sigrun Marie Moss.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you, Johanna. So as Johanna said, my key research area is social identities in conflict and the active use of such identities, particularly then when national leaders in conflict or post-conflict want to manipulate or use feelings of social identity in the population. We're all familiar with Tajbel's social identity definition. He said that part of the individual self-concept which derives from his knowledge of his membership of a social group together with the value and emotional significance attached to that membership. Social identity in the research done is often presented as something relatively passive. In my work, I look at how political leaders can attempt to use and manipulate social identities in conflicts, and looking particularly at national identity policies. Here we have Kagame of Rwanda and Dr. Shane and Malim Saif in Zanzibar. One of my contexts that I've been working in is Rwanda. In Rwanda, they speak Kinyarwanda. And the national identity strategy in Rwanda has been to focus on we are all Rwandans together, trying to abolish the feelings of ethnic identity and the group memberships of Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa. My second case has been Zanzibar, off the coast of Tanzania, where they speak Swahili. Here, there's a conflict between two relatively equal-sized political parties, and the identity policy has been to focus on the Zanzibari shared identity, but also allowing room for people to have feelings of political identity. Working in these contexts, as my Swahili is basic and my Kinyarwanda is non-existent, I rely on research assistance. I've done about 70 interviews with leaders and locals per case, and then have had to have 2 great research assistants in each case helping me along. I wanted to ask the respondents in my cases about their identity. I wanted to ask questions about this, and therefore I had these research assistants accompany me to most all of my interviews. Most people spoke a little bit of English, and mainly Kinyarwanda and Swahili. I wanted to ask people relatively open questions about what social categories and what social identities are at play here, and also how have these been changed and how are they influencing social relations. I wanted to ask these open questions not to presuppose any of the identities. Then I realized that these identities did not identity as a word did not exist. So I was well into my research when I realized that identity does not exist, which was a bit of a problem for me. And then I had to figure out what to do. So in Kinyarwanda, it turns out, I should have known before, itsinda is one word you can use for identity, and it means neutral group. So it's kind of like lawyers' associations or football teams, or you can say ubwoko, which basically means ethnic group related to conflict. Those were my 2 choices. So I sat down with my research assistant over coffee, and I asked him, so what have you been saying in these interviews when I've been saying identity? And he said, well, it doesn't exist as a word. So I've been saying instead ethnic group, when I thought he was saying identity. In Swahili as well, the word does not exist. So the closest we came to identity in Swahili is the word utambulisho, which basically means given identity, as the identity on your identity card, or sura, meaning physical appearance, or izalewa, meaning national belonging or feelings of nationalism. So the question was then, was I researching something non-existent or something that there was just no specific word for? As here with the dog saying to the other dog, you have to phrase it in another way. They, the cat, have no word for fetch. So an example of the former, of something that does not exist for certain groups, is, for example, land ownership. So certain groups of Native Americans, for example, used to not have the concept of land ownership because it gave no meaning to them, because they saw it as impossible to own land. So it was both not a word, but also not a practice that they recognized. In Swahili, on the other hand, you cannot say to miss. They do not have a word in Swahili for missing someone. Instead, they're using the English word to create a kind of colloquial kumisi. That, of course, does not make Swahili speakers immune to missing other people. And I think that the case here was more to the latter. When dealing with this in contexts like this, of course, the trustworthiness and the validity of the research comes into question. When the concepts in use are so different from what I think it is and what the respondents are using it as, can I then rely on the findings and the interpretations that I have? The question in my research became that the sense of identification surely did exist in these cases, but it meant that I needed to be much more specific than I had wanted to be. So rather than asking about all these multiple identities, I ended up asking very specifically about people's ethnic identity or political identity specifically. My key advice is to have very good conversations with excellent research assistants, better conversations than obviously the ones I had. They are such good experts and can really guide us through such processes. So that's a key recommendation. I also think it's wise to emphasize that the concepts that we have in psychology might not necessarily translate to people's lives, so that it's a long way, for instance, from Tajvel's definition to Oboko in Rwanda, which at the end of the day is a context where signs like please do not step on mass graves are necessary. So basically, in 6 minutes and 40 seconds, I hope that I have emphasized the wonderful complexities of working in translated contexts, but also emphasized the excellent role of good research assistants who will then help researchers like myself who get lost in translation. Thank you very much.